Somewhere beneath the surface of Windsor Castle, past the ceremonial rooms and the visitor corridors and the administrative spaces where the day-to-day business of the monarchy is conducted, there is a vault, not a single room, but a series of them, a layered, heavily secured, carefully managed complex of storage spaces that contain something that cannot be insured, cannot be replaced, and cannot be fully valued in any conventional financial sense. The private jewelry collection of the British royal family, not the crown jewels, those belong to the nation, kept at the Tower of London under the guardianship of the state, available for coronations and state occasions and the formal performances of monarchy that require the full weight of sovereign symbolism. What is kept in the vaults beneath Windsor is different. These are the personal pieces, the private collection, the jewels that were bought by queens and given by kings and inherited across generations in the particular intimate way that valuable objects move through families that have existed long enough to accumulate them across centuries. And as of a few weeks ago, according to sources whose access to the internal workings of the palace gives their account a credibility that demands attention, the access protocols governing those vaults have been fundamentally and apparently permanently changed. The change was not announced. It did not appear in any official palace communication, was no press release from Kensington Palace and no statement from the relevant household management teams and no public acknowledgement from any of the principals involved that anything had changed at all. That is, of course, precisely how William operates when he is doing something that he considers non-negotiable. He does it, documents it through the appropriate institutional channels, and allows the fact of it to speak for itself without the kind of public announcement that would invite the kind of public debate that he has already privately resolved. What happened, stripped of the procedural language that surrounds it, is this. Queen Camilla's access to the private jewelry collection, to the historic safes and storage systems that hold the late Queen Elizabeth's personal pieces, the private acquisitions of previous monarchs, and the inherited collection that constitutes what insiders describe as the monarchy's most intimate material legacy, has been revoked, not reduced, not restructured, revoked. The access codes have been changed. The authorization that previously allowed the Queen Consort's household to request and receive pieces from the collection for personal and official use has been withdrawn. The keys, in every meaningful sense of that word, have been turned. The person who now holds those keys, exclusively and without the kind of shared access arrangement that characterized the previous management of the collection, is William, the Prince of Wales, the future king, the man who has, in this act as in so many of the institutional moves we have reported on this channel over the past several months, demonstrated that his vision of how the monarchy's most significant assets should be managed in the years ahead does not include the informal and permissive access arrangements that accumulated during the preceding era. Subscribe right now if you are not already on this channel, tap that bell, because what I am about to walk you through is not simply a story about jewelry access protocols or the management of a historic collection. It is a story about what the monarchy's most tangible and irreplaceable assets actually are, about who has the authority to determine how those assets are used and by whom, and about why the decision William has made about the vaults is, in the context of everything else he has been doing, the clearest and most concrete signal yet about where this institution is heading and who is directing it. Every part of what follows matters. Stay with me. Let us begin with the collection itself, because the significance of William's vault lockdown cannot be properly understood without an honest appreciation of what the private jewelry collection, the British royal family, actually represents: its history, its composition, its value in the deepest and most serious sense of that word, and the specific reasons why access to it has always been understood, by those who think seriously about the governance of the institution, as a form of power rather than simply a logistical arrangement. The private collection is distinct from the crown jewels, and from the royal collection more broadly, and those distinctions matter enormously. The crown jewels, the sovereign's orb, the scepter with cross, St. Edward's crown, and the other pieces used in the coronation ceremony are state property. They belong to the nation in the same sense that the National Gallery's paintings belong to the nation, held in trust by the institution that maintains them, accessible in the ways the institution determines, but ultimately the patrimony of the public rather than the personal possession of any individual. Their management is governed by formal state protocols that give no single individual, not even the monarch, unconstrained personal authority over them. The private collection is governed by an entirely different set of principles. These pieces were bought, given, inherited, and accumulated as personal property by successive members of the royal family. They are owned, in the private legal sense that distinguishes personal property from state property, by the individuals in whose names they sit, or by the estates of those who accumulated them. The late Queen Elizabeth II's private collection was among the most significant and historically rich in the world. Pieces accumulated across 70 years of a reign, during which state gifts of extraordinary quality arrived from governments around the world, pieces inherited from her grandmother Queen Mary, whose own collection was legendary, pieces given to her by Prince Philip, and by various members of the extended royal family over the course of a marriage and a family life that spanned decades. When she died, those pieces did not become state property. They became part of her private estate, subject to inheritance arrangements that were made, as is standard for private individuals in the United Kingdom, through the normal mechanisms of a will and the legal processes that surround it. The specific arrangements for who inherited what, and what conditions attached to those inheritances, are not fully public. The Queen's will has been sealed, as is standard for senior royals, pending a period of private administration. But what is known is that the broad intent was to keep the collection within the royal family, and to ensure that the most historically and symbolically significant pieces remained accessible for the ceremonial and representative purposes that they have served across generations. This is the context in which the access protocols governing the Windsor vaults need to be understood. The vaults do not contain only pieces that have already been formally allocated through the inheritance process. They contain pieces that are in various stages of that process, pieces whose eventual disposition is being determined through the ongoing administration of the estate, pieces whose status as personal property versus shared family resource is a matter of ongoing family and legal consideration, and pieces whose symbolic significance makes their management not merely a personal or legal question, but an institutional one. Who has access to those pieces during the period of ongoing estate administration is not a trivial question. It is, in the language of institutional governance, a question of custody. And custody, as anyone who has navigated a significant estate knows, is a question of power. Camilla had access, past tense. She had it because she was the queen consort, because her position as the reigning sovereign's wife carried with it certain courtesies in relation to the royal household's resources, including the jewelry collection, that the institution had historically extended to the wife of the monarch. That access was not formally defined in any document that specified exactly which pieces she could use, and in what circumstances and under what conditions. It was the product of informal institutional practice, of the assumption shared by the relevant household management staff that the queen consort's access to the collection was part of what her position entitled her to, and that the specifics of how that access was exercised could be managed through the same informal good faith arrangements that governed many aspects of the senior royal household's operations. William has concluded that informal is not good enough, not for this, not now. And the reasons behind that conclusion are worth examining in detail, because they reveal something important about both the specific situation he is responding to and the broader institutional philosophy he is establishing. The specific situation, according to sources familiar with the internal palace discussions that preceded the vault lockdown, involves concerns about the pattern of access that had developed in the period since Charles's accession. Not a single dramatic incident, not evidence of pieces going missing or being damaged or being used in ways that were straightforwardly inappropriate, but a pattern, the same word you will note, that appeared in the reporting about the black ledger of access that went beyond what the institutional purposes of the collection justified, and that was not subject to the kind of documented oversight that the management of historically significant assets at this level of importance requires. The specific concerns, as described by those familiar with the discussions, fall into two categories. The first is the frequency and informality of access, the regularity with which pieces from the collection were being requested and removed for use, that went beyond the formal public and semi-formal events that the collection exists to serve, and the degree to which those requests and removals were being processed outside the formal documentation systems that the collection's custodians are supposed to maintain. Pieces being used at private events, pieces being returned without the standard condition assessment, pieces being accessed in ways and at times that fell outside the scheduled management processes that are supposed to govern the handling of irreplaceable historic items. The second concern is more institutional and more politically significant. The collection includes pieces that are specifically associated with Queen Elizabeth II's personal legacy, pieces that carry symbolic weight as expressions of her identity, her taste, her private life as distinct from her public role. Pieces that, in the context of the ongoing questions about Diana's legacy and Catherine's relationship to it, carry a specific meaning that goes beyond their material value. Pieces that William, as the son of the woman who built the most significant part of that legacy, and as the husband of the woman he considers its rightful inheritor, has strong and specific views about who should wear and in what contexts. The fact that those pieces were accessible through informal channels that gave Camilla's household the ability to request and use them in contexts and for purposes that William's team was not always informed of in advance and did not always consider appropriate, was, according to sources, a specific and growing concern in the months leading up to the vault lockdown. Drop a comment telling me whether you think William's response is proportionate, because this is the kind of institutional question where the right answer is genuinely contested. And the most interesting analysis on this channel always comes from the people who are willing to engage with the complexity rather than the people who reach for the obvious take. The vault lockdown itself, the specific security changes that William authorized and that were implemented in the period that palace insiders have since described as the overnight shift, involved several layers of action. The most fundamental was the change to the physical access controls governing the storage areas. The codes were changed. The authorization hierarchy was restructured so that requests for access to collection go through a formal approval process managed by William's household team, rather than through the informal request channels that previously allowed the various royal households to access the collection through the estate management apparatus without a centralized approval step. The documentation requirements were also significantly strengthened. Every piece removed from the collection for any purpose, for use at an official event, for conservation assessment, for formal photography, for any reason whatsoever, is now required to be logged in a standardized system that records who requested the piece, for what purpose, when it was removed, when it was returned, and what condition assessment was conducted at both points. This is, in the world of museum and heritage asset management, entirely standard practice. It is the basic infrastructure of responsible custody for irreplaceable historic items. The fact that it represents a significant tightening of the previous arrangements tells you something important about how those previous arrangements functioned. The restricted list, the specific pieces that have been moved to a higher security tier within the overall system, accessible only through an even more rigorous approval process that requires William's personal or formally delegated authorization, includes, according to sources, the pieces most closely associated with the late Queen's personal collection, as distinct from the broader family inheritance. The pieces that Elizabeth acquired personally rather than inheriting, the pieces given to her by Philip, the pieces from the private collection that carry the specific weight of her identity as a woman rather than her identity as a monarch. It also includes, according to sources, the pieces most closely associated with Diana, the lover's knot tiara, the South Sea pearl drop earrings, the pieces that Diana wore publicly in ways that made them inseparable from her image and her story. These pieces are now, under William's new protocols, in a security tier that makes Camilla's household access to them effectively impossible without a formal approval process that William controls. This means that whatever future events or occasions might arise at which the question of who wears what from this part of the collection becomes relevant, the answer will be determined not by informal custom or institutional courtesy, but by a formal protocol whose decision-making authority sits exclusively with the Prince of Wales. The George Mandate is the frame through which William articulates the long-term purpose of what he has done. It is the frame that makes the vault lockdown not a reactive response to a specific
problem, but a proactive institutional measure. designed to ensure that the collection's management reflects the priorities that will govern the monarchy for the next generation. And those priorities, as William has made clear in various institutional contexts, center on a single and non-negotiable principle: the most significant assets of the monarchy belong to the direct line of succession,
are managed in ways that reflect the priorities of the direct line, and are not available for use in ways that serve the interests of individuals whose relationship to the institution is defined by their proximity to the current sovereign, rather than by their place in the future of the crown. George Alexander Louis, Prince of Wales, is 12 years old. He will one day be king. The collection that William is now securing, the private jewels of the monarchy, the historic pieces that carry the weight of generations of royal identity, the pieces associated most specifically with the women who have shaped the institution's public image across the 20th and 21st centuries, will be George's inheritance in every meaningful sense of that word. Not necessarily his legal property in all cases, but the inheritance of context and meaning and institutional association that makes these pieces what they are, rather than simply what they are worth. William wants to ensure that when George comes to the throne, the most important pieces of that inheritance are intact. Not physically, the pieces themselves are unlikely to go anywhere, but symbolically and institutionally. He wants to ensure that the associations those pieces carry, what they represent, who wore them, what they mean as expressions of the monarchy's identity, have not been diluted by a period of informal and unsupervised use that attaches them to contexts and associations that do not serve the interests of the direct line. He wants to ensure that the lover's knot tiara, when it appears in public in the years ahead, appears on Catherine's head, or in due time on the heads of the women who follow Catherine, not on the head of someone whose claim to that symbolic pivotry is derived from marriage to the current king, rather than from her place in the future of the institution. This is the George mandate. It is not about controlling Camilla personally. It is about ensuring that the symbolic geography of the monarchy's most visible assets is preserved in ways that serve the institution's long-term legitimacy, rather than its current internal social arrangements. Subscribe now if you have not already, and share this video, because the management of the royal jewelry collection is one of those institutional questions that looks like a peripheral story about luxury items and actually turns out, when you examine it properly, to be a story about power, legitimacy, and the question of who controls the physical expressions of the monarchy's identity. That is not a peripheral story. It is the central story. Let us talk about Camilla's navigation of the vault lockdown, because her response to it tells us something important about where she currently sits within the institution, and what options she has available to her. She has, on the surface, said nothing. No statement, no public acknowledgement, no visible indication that anything has changed in the management of the jewelry collection or in her household's relationship to it. This is the Camilla playbook at its most disciplined, when the institutional environment is moving against you in ways that you cannot directly contest. You maintain the surface with absolute composure, and you wait for the situation to develop in ways that might create an opening for recalibration. But beneath the surface, according to sources familiar with the conversations within Clarence House, the response is something different. It is described as a combination of genuine surprise and controlled fury. Surprise at the speed and completeness of the lockdown, which went further and faster than those around Camilla had anticipated, and fury at the public signal it sends about her position within the institutional hierarchy. The vault lockdown is not a secret. It is not something that the relevant household staff will be unaware of, or that the palace's broader administrative apparatus will not notice. The change to the access protocols is visible to everyone who needs to interact with the jewelry management system, which is a significant number of people in a household as large and as operationally complex as the royal household. The signal it sends that Camilla's institutional standing has been reduced to a point where access arrangements that were previously available to her as a matter of course are now controlled by the man who will succeed her husband is a signal that everyone who receives it will understand. Camilla understands it too, and the question of what she does with that understanding, how she navigates a situation in which her formal title and her position as the reigning king's wife are entirely secure, but her practical institutional influence is being systematically reduced by the man who holds the levers that the future of the monarchy turns on, is the most significant unanswered question in her current palace situation. She cannot formally challenge the vault lockdown. The legal and institutional basis for William's action is sound. He has the authority derived from his position as the primary heir and the master of the Duchy of Cornwall, and the person with the most significant institutional stake in the long-term management of the monarchy's assets, to restructure the access protocols in ways that reflect the priorities he considers important. There is no formal mechanism through which Camilla can contest that authority in relation to a collection whose management has always rested on informal arrangements rather than formally defined rights. She cannot go through Charles in the way that she has historically been able to use her relationship with the king as a buffer against institutional pressure from other directions. Charles, as we reported in relation to the Parker Bowles files, has adopted what sources describe as a policy of deliberate non-intervention in relation to William's institutional moves, a policy that reflects his understanding that the monarchy's future belongs to William, and that his greatest contribution to that future is to ensure that William has the space to shape it. The king's response to the vault lockdown, when it was communicated to him through the relevant household channels, was, sources say, a quiet acknowledgement followed by a complete absence of instruction to reverse or modify what William had done. What she can do, and what those around her suggest she is doing, is manage the public dimension of her situation with the sustained professionalism that has been her greatest institutional asset throughout her royal life. She appears at official events. She conducts her charitable work. She stands beside the king at the occasions that require the visible unity of the senior royal household, and she does all of this while wearing pieces from the jewelry collection that she still has access to through the protocols that remain in place, the pieces that fall outside the restricted tier that William has established, the pieces that are not in the highest security category, the pieces whose symbolic associations do not make them central to the question of who controls the monarchy's most significant material legacy. She wears them beautifully. She always has, and she is too intelligent and too experienced in the management of her own public image to allow the vault lockdown to become visible in the choices she makes about what to wear and when. The surface holds, but the institutional reality beneath the surface, the reality that the collection's most significant pieces are now under protocols that she cannot access, that the symbolic geography of the monarchy's jewelry has been redrawn in a way that places her firmly outside the inner circle of that geography, is one that she and those around her are navigating with a difficulty that the composed public surface entirely conceals. Let me address the question that some in the commentary space have raised about whether William's action represents an appropriate exercise of his institutional authority or an overreach that goes beyond what his current position formally allows, because this is a genuine question, and it deserves a genuine answer rather than a dismissive one. The argument that it is an overreach runs as follows: William is not king, he is the heir apparent. The constitutional and institutional authority of the heir apparent is real and growing, particularly in a context where the reigning sovereign's health requires an increasing delegation of royal functions to his successor. But it is not equivalent to the authority of a reigning sovereign. The management of the royal household's assets, including the private jewelry collection, is ultimately a matter for the person who sits on the throne, and the formal authority to restructure the access protocols governing that collection sits with the monarch rather than with his heir. The argument that it is not an overreach runs as follows. The private jewelry collection's management has always rested on informal arrangements rather than formally codified rights, and the management of informal arrangements is not governed by the same constitutional hierarchy as the management of formal constitutional functions. William's authority as the master of the Duchy of Cornwall and as the person with the most significant institutional stake in the long-term management of the monarchy's assets gives him a legitimate basis for restructuring informal arrangements that he considers inadequate. The king's failure to object to or reverse the restructuring is a form of consent that carries its own institutional weight, and the practical reality of the current household power dynamics, in which William's institutional authority is growing steadily in ways that the formal constitutional position does not fully capture, makes the application of a narrow formal analysis to a question of informal institutional management, misleading rather than illuminating. I think both arguments contain something real, and I think the most honest answer is that William is operating in a space where his formal authority and his practical authority are not perfectly aligned, where what he can do as a matter of institutional reality goes somewhat beyond what a strict constitutional analysis of his formal position would clearly endorse. He is aware of this. He is operating in this space deliberately, because he has concluded that the pace of institutional change required by the current situation cannot wait for the formal succession that would give him the fully anchored authority he is already functionally exercising. Whether you consider that appropriate or not depends in significant part on whether you share his assessment of how urgently the institutional changes he is driving need to happen. If you think the informal culture of the royal household has been producing problems serious enough to require immediate structural correction, then the exercise of authority somewhat ahead of its formal schedule looks like leadership. If you think the changes are being driven more by William's desire to control the institutional environment he will inherit than by a genuine institutional emergency, then it looks like overreach. The comments are where you tell me which of those things you think it is. And I want serious analysis, not the quick takes, not the partisan positions, but the honest engagement with the genuine ambiguity of a situation in which a future king is doing what future kings have rarely had either the opportunity or the courage to do, actively shaping the institution before the crown touches his head. The vault lockdown is a statement. It is the most tangible and the most undeniable statement in a series of statements that William has been making across the past 2 years, through a series of decisions that, taken individually, could each be explained in their own institutional terms, but that, taken together, form a coherent and unmistakable program. He is establishing a new order, not through dramatic proclamations or public confrontations or the kind of visible power struggle that would generate the wrong kind of coverage and produce the wrong kind of institutional damage, through the systematic, methodical, quietly determined restructuring of the informal arrangements that govern how the monarchy's most significant assets, financial, symbolic, material, archival, are managed and by whom, through the replacement of the permissive informality of the previous era with the documented accountability of the era he is building, through the drawing of clear lines between who is inside the direct line and who is adjacent to it, and the insistence that those lines be reflected in the management of the institution's most important resources. The jewelry collection, the financial audit, the Parker Bowles files, the Spencer tiara, the vault lockdown, these are not separate stories. They are chapters in a single story about the most consequential institutional transformation the British monarchy has undergone since the death of Diana, and perhaps since the abdication crisis of 1936. They are the story of a future king who has decided that the informal culture of the institution he is inheriting is not adequate to the demands of the century it must navigate, and who has used every tool available to him to begin the work of changing it before the crown gives him the formal authority to do so. That work is not finished. The vault lockdown is not the final act. William is not, by any account of those who know him and understand how he operates, at the end of this process. He is in the middle of it. Moving steadily through the institutional landscape of the monarchy he will lead, restructuring what needs restructuring, securing what needs securing, and ensuring that the assets, material and symbolic, that define what the monarchy is, are in the hands of the people he trusts to carry them forward. Those people, in every significant instance, turn out to be the same people: Catherine, the direct line, George and Charlotte, and Louis and the generation they represent. The future, as William understands it, over the comfort of the present as others have arranged it. The vault is locked. The access list has been changed, and the collection that represents the most intimate material legacy of the British monarchy is now under the guardianship of the man who will, in the fullness of time, be responsible for deciding how that legacy is carried into the century ahead. Is he right? Is the vault lockdown the right call? The appropriate exercise of the institutional authority available to him in service of the legitimate long-term interests of the monarchy and the direct line? Or is it a step that goes beyond what his current position formally permits, justified by a vision of the future that has not yet received the constitutional endorsement that the formal succession will eventually provide? Drop your most honest take in the comments. Tell me whether you think Camilla can recover her institutional standing in the wake of a series of actions that have each individually reduced her footprint within the palace, and that together amount to the most systematic reduction of a queen consort's informal power in living memory. Tell me whether you think Charles is making the right decision by allowing it to happen, by choosing the institution's future over his wife's present comfort, in a way that says something significant about both his character and his understanding of his own role. Tell me whether the George mandate justifies the means William is using to implement it, or whether a future king who reshapes the institution ahead of his formal accession is setting a precedent that future heirs might use in ways that are less clearly in the institution's best interests. Subscribe, like, share this with the people in your network who are following the palace power shift with the seriousness it deserves. Because this story, the story of how the British monarchy is being remade, asset by asset and protocol by protocol, and informal arrangement by renegotiated formal one, by the man who has not yet been crowned but is already, in every meaningful institutional sense, acting like a king, is the most important royal story of our time. The vault is locked, the keys are with William, and the monarchy he is building, one deliberate and quietly extraordinary move at a time, is beginning to look like the institution that the next century will need it to be. We will be watching every move of that building, and we will be here to tell you what it means.